And the big one of the ones I've been fighting since like 2015. I didn't realize it would even turn into a thing because it was always so insane to me. The transgender issue. There's going to be no more castrating our children for big pharma and medical profit. That bullshit ends now. Federal funding is being cut off for sex change operations for minors. I never understood it. I never understood. Say, wait. So a 3-year-old can decide to permanently mutilate their body, be put on toxic drugs for the rest of their life. But a 25-year-old has no idea what they're doing when they're signing.
The words that just emerged from Donald Trump Jr.'s mouth, delivered with the kind of smirking satisfaction that only someone insulated from material consequences can truly muster, represent something far more insidious than mere policy disagreement, or even garden-variety cruelty. And here is where we need to pay extraordinarily close attention. The Trump administration just days ago proposed 2 rules to withhold federal funds in connection with gender-affirming care for trans minors, including puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery, with the most stringent rule barring facilities that offer this care from receiving any funding from the federal Medicare or Medicaid programs. And what we are witnessing is not simply a healthcare debate, but the deliberate construction of a genocidal infrastructure disguised in the rhetoric of child protection. And suddenly that phrase child castration becomes so much clearer in its strategic deployment, because language has always been the first battlefield in the war against marginalized communities. When Junior speaks of castrating our children for big pharma and medical profit, he is engaging in what Hannah Arendt might recognize as the banality of evil wrapped in populist aesthetics, this perverse synthesis where genuine anxieties about pharmaceutical industry profit motives become weaponized, not against the actual mechanisms of capital accumulation and corporate malfeasance, but against some of the most vulnerable young people in our society, transgender youth, who according to data represent less than 0.1% of adolescents ages 8 to 17 with private insurance, who are prescribed puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones, about 5,100 individuals, and this microscopic population somehow becomes the locus of conservative moral panic, while actual systemic problems of pharmaceutical pricing and insurance industry predation affecting millions remain conveniently unaddressed, because this was never about protecting children or challenging corporate power. Now let me be absolutely crystal clear about what just happened in that clip, because the stakes could not be higher, and what comes next should make every person who values bodily autonomy and medical privacy deeply afraid. The Trump administration Thursday proposed 2 rules targeting hospitals that treat transgender children and youth, using Medicare and Medicaid as the lever, and the move would affect trans youth who have private insurance too, which means we are looking at the federal government using its fiscal power to effectively eliminate an entire category of healthcare nationwide through financial coercion, and this would effectively force most medical centers to cease providing it, because no hospital system can survive without Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. And here is the fascist mechanic at work in real time, the way authoritarianism doesn't always announce itself with jackboots and midnight arrests, but sometimes arrives through bureaucratic violence and funding restrictions and regulatory capture. The grotesque irony of the Trump family suddenly cosplaying as champions against Big Pharma through their Make America Healthy Again performance art would be laughable if it weren't so transparently cynical and dangerous, because the Associated Press describes MAHA as anti-science, fueled by a web of well-funded national groups led by people who've profited financially and otherwise from sowing distrust of medicine and science, with several individuals within and around the Trump administration promoting MAHA having profited financially from products endorsed by the movement. But we have grifters wrapping themselves in the language of health freedom while systematically dismantling evidence-based medical care and replacing it with conspiratorial thinking and market opportunities for their supplement companies and wellness brands. The comparison Junior makes about 3-year-olds deciding to permanently mutilate their body versus 25-year-olds not understanding student loans is such a masterclass in bad faith argumentation that we need to dissect it with surgical precision, because this is how moral panics operate through the construction of imaginary scenarios that bear no relationship to material reality. And let me state unequivocally what the actual medical consensus demonstrates. Prepubertally, no medical intervention is recommended, and once puberty has commenced, youth are eligible for puberty blockers, and post-pubertally youth are eligible for feminizing and masculinizing hormone regimens, which means that the specter of toddlers undergoing irreversible procedures is a complete fabrication designed to generate outrage among people unfamiliar with how gender-affirming care actually functions. Furthermore, all medical interventions for any child under the age of 18 require parental consent as well as the child's assent. So this libertarian fever dream of children making unilateral decisions about their bodies in defiance of their parents is simply not how this process works, and never has been, but truth has never been the point of these rhetorical exercises, because the point is emotional manipulation, and the activation of disgust responses, and the construction of transgender people as threats to be eliminated from public life. Research demonstrates with extraordinary consistency that the rate of teens ages 15 to 17 undergoing gender-affirming surgery was 2.1 per 100,000, and no cases were reported under the age of 12. So when we hear apocalyptic language about an epidemic of child surgeries, we are being lied to with malicious intent by people who understand that their audience will not fact-check their claims, but will instead internalize the horror they have been instructed to feel. But wait, because here comes the next bombshell, and this is where the full architecture of this eliminationist project reveals itself in its most chilling dimensions. Just a day before the HHS announcement, the House passed a bill that would charge doctors with a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison if they provide gender-affirming care for minors, which represents an escalation from merely defunding care to actively criminalizing medical professionals who provide evidence-based treatment, and we need to understand this in the context of how authoritarian regimes consolidate power by first delegitimizing expertise and then punishing anyone who refuses to comply with ideological mandates masquerading as public health policy. The fact that in 2025, 1,020 bills are under consideration across the country that would negatively impact trans and gender non-conforming people, with this number anticipated to grow with reveals that this is a coordinated national campaign with staggering resources behind it, and 93% of transgender youth ages 13 to 17 in the U.S., an estimated 280,300 transgender youth, live in states that have passed or proposed one or more laws banning access to gender-affirming care, participation in sports, use of bathrooms and other sex-separated facilities, or affirmation of gender through pronoun use, meaning that we are witnessing the systematic exclusion of an entire population from civic participation and medical access through legislative siege warfare, when Republicans discovered that if corporations wanted to apply HB2-like pressure in 2024, they now would find themselves in conflict with almost half the country, since currently 25 states have laws or policies on the books limiting trans people's sports participation, and the same number have partial or full bans on trans youth medical care in place. They understood that there was indeed strength in numbers, and that they could overwhelm resistance through sheer volume of simultaneous attacks across multiple jurisdictions, which is textbook authoritarian strategy borrowed from the way abortion access was systematically dismantled through state-level action before Roe was overturned. Now here is what makes this moment so urgently terrifying, and why we cannot afford liberal complacency or both sides' equivocation. Several studies have shown that young people with access to gender-affirming care have better mental and emotional health outcomes than those without access, while blocking access to care has been shown to worsen mental health, including increasing the risk of suicide, and gender-affirming care is in many aspects life-saving, with plenty of evidence showing it decreases anxiety and depression in patients, which means that what the Trump administration is doing through these funding restrictions and what Republicans in the House are doing through criminalization legislation is knowingly and willfully increasing suicide risk among minors. And I want to linger on that moral catastrophe for a moment, because research found that gender-affirming medical interventions were associated with lower odds of depression and suicidality over 12 months, and research shows access to puberty blockers during adolescence is associated with a significant decrease in suicidal ideation. So when conservatives claim to be protecting children, they are in fact implementing policies that evidence demonstrates will lead directly to more dead children, and they know this because they have been told this repeatedly by every major medical organization. The American Academy of Pediatrics states there is strong consensus among the most prominent medical organizations worldwide that evidence-based gender-affirming care for transgender children and adolescents is medically necessary and appropriate. Yet this administration and its allies in Congress have decided that their ideological commitments and political calculations outweigh the recommendations of people who have spent their entire careers studying pediatric medicine and adolescent mental health. The Make America Healthy Again branding is particularly Orwellian when you understand that in May, HHS released a review declaring that the quality of evidence regarding the effects of gender-affirming care for minors is very low, breaking with the majority of U.S. medical associations which support access to such care and have condemned efforts to restrict it, which represents the Trump administration manufacturing its own scientific consensus in opposition to the actual medical establishment in a pattern that should be immediately recognizable to anyone who watched the tobacco industry manufacture doubt about smoking or the fossil fuel industry manufacture uncertainty about climate change. This is epistemological warfare, where the very concept of expertise becomes contested terrain, and where political appointees with no medical training get to override doctors and researchers because authoritarian power cannot tolerate independent sources of authority that might contradict its ideological imperatives. And let us not forget that in May 2025, the Democratic National Committee criticized MAHA for fabricating sources in their report, with analysis revealing multiple references to non-existent studies and authors suggestive of the use of artificial intelligence, as well as mischaracterizations of the conclusions of real sources. So they are not just ignoring medical consensus, but actively fabricating evidence to justify policies that will harm children, and they are doing this with the full apparatus of the federal government behind them. What Junior is selling in that clip with his smug assurance about ending castration is the comforting fiction that there exists a simple solution to a fabricated problem, and that the real villains are pharmaceutical companies and corrupt medical establishments preying on confused children rather than a systematic political movement dedicated to eliminating transgender people from public existence. And we can trace the genealogy of this rhetoric through every moral panic from satanic ritual abuse to the weaponization of groomer language to QAnon conspiracy theories about elite pedophile rings, because these are all variations on the same theme of imagined threats to children that justify increasingly authoritarian interventions in private medical decisions and family autonomy. The libertarian framing of parental rights and medical freedom gets abandoned the instant we are talking about care for transgender youth, because this was never about freedom or autonomy, but about enforcing a particular vision of gender conformity through state violence and the threat of imprisonment for doctors who refuse to comply. Notice how the same people who spent the pandemic years screaming about bodily autonomy and medical choice are now celebrating the federal government dictating what treatments doctors can provide and threatening healthcare workers with felony charges, revealing that their opposition was never about freedom, but about which populations they believe deserve protection and which populations they believe should be disciplined into submission or eliminated altogether. The policy implications of what continued political pressure from agencies across the government, including CMS, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Trade Commission, has led some health systems to abandon offerings for gender-affirming care for minors, extend far beyond the immediate harm to transgender youth, because once you establish the precedent that the federal government can use funding as a weapon to override medical consensus and eliminate entire categories of care, then you have created a mechanism that can be deployed against any politically disfavored treatment, and conservatives have already made clear that they view reproductive health care, contraception access, and even certain psychiatric medications as potential targets for similar interventions. The MAHA Commission's executive order directed it to examine the prevalence of and threat posed by the prescription of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, stimulants, and weight loss drugs within 100 days, and the Commission was also tasked with researching childhood diseases and mental disorders, including autism, which suggests that SSRIs and psychiatric care for children could be next on the chopping block once they have successfully eliminated gender-affirming care, because authoritarian movements never stop with one target, but continuously identify new populations and practices to pathologize and criminalize. This is the eliminationist logic working itself out through bureaucratic channels and regulatory mechanism, the way that fascism in the 21st century operates through the manipulation of administrative procedures and funding streams, rather than only through overt violence, though the violence is always there, lurking beneath the surface, in the form of imprisonment threats for doctors and forced detransition for youth, and the structural violence of denied healthcare that will inevitably result in preventable deaths. The students of history among us will recognize the patterns here, because we have seen this before in the pathologization of homosexuality and the forced institutionalization of anyone who deviated from sexual norms, in the eugenics movement that sterilized disabled people and immigrants in the name of protecting racial purity and public health, in every moment when state power allied with reactionary moral crusades to define certain populations as threats requiring elimination through medical violence disguised as therapeutic intervention. LGBTQ+ advocates see sex redefinition bills as a clear indication of the ultimate goal of anti-trans legislation, to make it near impossible for transgender people to safely participate in public life. and we should believe them because proposed legislation would prevent trans people from being able to update driver's licenses, hold public office, use public restrooms, or take shelter from domestic violence unless they do so according to their sex assigned at birth, which represents the legal construction of an underclass denied access to basic civic participation and public accommodations. And once you have established that certain people do not deserve recognition under law, you have created the conditions for eliminationist violence, whether through direct state action or through the kind of ambient persecution that makes existence itself unbearable. We know that families with transgender children are having conversations about where their red line is when they need to flee the country, which should shock the conscience of anyone who believes in liberal democracy and human rights, because we are talking about American citizens fleeing their own country to access basic medical care for their children. Yet this administration celebrates these expulsions as policy victories in their war against what they characterize as gender ideology. The populist framing that Junior deploys linking big pharma profits to transgender healthcare is particularly insidious because it takes a kernel of legitimate critique about pharmaceutical industry pricing and profit-seeking behavior and weaponizes it against people who need medical care, rather than against the actual structures of pharmaceutical capitalism that price insulin beyond reach and charge thousands for cancer treatments and lobby against drug price negotiations. Officials on Thursday estimated that some $30 million in federal funds went toward gender-affirming care in 2023, which in the context of American healthcare spending is a rounding error that barely registers compared to the hundreds of billions that flow to pharmaceutical companies annually for other treatments, revealing that this is not actually about controlling costs or challenging corporate power, but about cutting off access to care for a specific population that Republicans have decided to scapegoat. If the Trump administration were genuinely interested in confronting pharmaceutical industry profiteering, they would be pursuing Medicare negotiations for all drug prices and supporting the importation of cheaper medications from Canada and cracking down on evergreening practices that extend patent monopolies, but instead they are targeting one of the smallest budget items in American healthcare that happens to serve a politically vulnerable population, and that tells you everything about what this is actually about, because fascism has always understood that moral crusades against marginalized groups are useful for consolidating power and distracting from material inequality and economic exploitation. What should absolutely enrage every person watching this clip is that moderate to very low certainty evidence from studies suggests gender-affirming care may improve quality of life, stigma, utilization of health services, and mental health, with no studies identifying significant negative outcomes or harms, medicalization, and yet we have a presidential administration systematically dismantling access to this care, based not on evidence, but on ideological commitment to a particular vision of gender normativity that requires the forcible suppression of any alternative modes of embodiment. The fact that the administration plans to withhold federal money that could be used for gender-affirming care for minors from hospitals and healthcare providers, despite substantial evidence that such care is safe and effective, represents a fundamental rejection of evidence-based medicine in favor of policy-based evidence, where you determine your outcome first and then work backwards to find or fabricate justifications that will support predetermined conclusions. This is precisely how climate denial operates and how evolution gets challenged in classrooms, and how we end up with hydroxychloroquine being promoted as a COVID treatment despite lacking efficacy, because once you establish that political ideology can override scientific consensus, you have opened the door to every form of medical quackery and conspiratorial thinking that happens to align with the interests of those in power. The language of child protection has always been the preferred aesthetic of authoritarianism, because it allows the most repressive measures to be framed as caring interventions and positions anyone who objects as defenders of harm, rather than defenders of freedom, and this is why Junior can say with a straight face that they are ending child castration, when what they are actually doing is preventing adolescents from accessing puberty blockers that are fully reversible and have been used safely for decades to treat precocious puberty in cisgender children. Doctors have used these medications safely for decades for cisgender children who experience precocious puberty, so puberty blockers are not experimental or dangerous, but rather represent established medical practice that suddenly becomes pathologized when deployed in service of gender-affirming care. The double standard is the point, because the cruelty is the point, and the goal is to make existence as a transgender person so precarious and so medicalized, and so subject to state surveillance and potential criminalization, that fewer people will choose to transition, or will be forced back into the closet, or will flee the country, and each of those outcomes represents a victory for the Eliminations Project, even if they do not rise to the level of direct violence. We need to name what is happening here with absolute clarity because the stakes demand nothing less than total moral and political commitment to resistance. Anti-LGBTQ+ legislation has escalated dramatically in the last 4 years, both in quantity and in kind, with last year seeing the number of anti-LGBTQ+ bills triple over the previous year, with more than 500 bills introduced and nearly 90 enacted and signed into law. And non-binary and transgender people have been at the epicenter of most of this legislation, which represents a coordinated assault on transgender existence that cannot be separated from the broader authoritarian project of defining who counts as fully human and who can be legitimately excluded from social protection. These attacks have inflicted an enormous mental, physical, and emotional toll on transgender people and their families, even when these bills do not get signed into law, with the hateful rhetoric used to support these attacks, and the junk science weaponized in support of them having a long-standing negative impact on the lives of living, breathing transgender people who already experience high rates of harassment, discrimination, and violence, only. So the harm is not only in the policies that pass, but in the constant barrage of legislative attacks that communicate to transgender people that they are unwelcome and unsafe, and that their very existence is a matter of endless political contestation. This is eliminationism through exhaustion, through making daily life so draining, and so filled with obstacles, and so subject to hostile political scrutiny, that survival itself becomes an act of resistance requiring resources that many people simply do not have. The Make America Healthy Again branding cannot disguise what this administration is actually doing, which is making America vastly less healthy for transgender youth, specifically, and for anyone who values bodily autonomy and medical privacy more broadly, because once you have established that politicians, rather than doctors, get to determine appropriate care based on ideological preferences rather than clinical evidence, you have fundamentally broken the covenant between medical professionals and patients that is supposed to be mediated by science rather than by state power. Kennedy released a report that attacked gender-affirming care and rejected the medical consensus of experts in transgender care, and President Donald Trump has issued several executive orders that deny the existence of transgender people and aim to restrict their access to care or participation in sports, which reveals the eliminations logic operating at the highest levels of government, where the goal is not to regulate care or ensure safety, but to deny the possibility of transgender identity altogether by making it legally and medically impossible to transition. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and others repeatedly challenged the existence of transgender people entirely during the news conference, with multiple speakers making references denying the existence of transgender people and suggesting that children who are transgender have been influenced by politics or social ideologies, they were articulating the core premise of this entire crusade, which is that transgender people do not really exist, but are rather victims of ideological manipulation or medical experimentation. And from that premise it follows that preventing transition is not denying people care, but rather saving them from a delusion, which is precisely the logic that was used to justify conversion therapy and forced institutionalization for gay people for decades. Every person who cares about justice and human dignity needs to understand that what is unfolding right now is a test case for how far this administration can go in using federal power to override medical consensus and eliminate politically disfavored populations from public life. And if they succeed in making it effectively impossible to access gender-affirming care anywhere in the country through funding restrictions and criminalization, then they will have established a mechanism that can be deployed against abortion access that remains legal, against birth control that conservatives increasingly describe as abortifacient, against sex education in schools, against any form of healthcare or information that conflicts with conservative Christian nationalism's vision of appropriate embodiment and sexuality. The transgender community has always been the canary in the coal mine for authoritarian movements because trans people represent a fundamental challenge to binary thinking and fixed categories that authoritarianism requires to organize the world into us versus them, normal versus deviant, protected versus disposable, and attacking trans people allows conservatives to test how much eliminations rhetoric and policy the broader public will tolerate before there is meaningful resistance. What Junior is doing in that clip is normalizing the language of mutilation and castration and child abuse to describe evidence-based medical care supported by every major medical organization, and he does so with confidence because he knows that large segments of the American public have been primed through years of propaganda to believe that transgender healthcare represents a unique threat rather than a small category of medical intervention that improves outcomes for a tiny minority of young people who need it. The path forward requires not liberal hand-wringing or both sides' discourse about legitimate concerns, but rather uncompromising solidarity with transgender communities and absolute opposition to every piece of legislation that restricts access to gender-affirming care, because we are long past the point where compromise is possible, or where there exists a middle ground between evidence-based medicine and eliminationist ideology dressed up as child protection. We need to understand that supporting transgender rights is not a niche issue separate from broader struggles for healthcare justice and bodily autonomy, but is rather central to those struggles because the mechanisms being deployed against trans people will be used against everyone who needs reproductive health care, or psychiatric care, or any treatment that conservatives decide violates their ideological commitments. The fight against these policies is the fight against medical authoritarianism and the fight for the principle that healthcare decisions should be made between patients, families, and doctors based on evidence rather than imposed by politicians, pursuing culture war victories, and losing this fight means accepting that the federal government can dictate who deserves care and who can be legally erased from existence through administrative violence. When Donald Trump Jr. celebrates the end of what he calls child castration, he is celebrating the beginning of a new phase of state-sponsored eliminationism that will not stop with transgender youth, but will continue identifying new targets until we build the political power necessary to stop it. And that work begins with refusing to accept the framing that this is about protecting children rather than harming them, with refusing to treat eliminationist propaganda as legitimate policy debate, and with building the kind of mass movement capable of making these policies politically untenable through sustained resistance in the streets and in the courts, and at every level of government where these attacks are being prosecuted against some of the most vulnerable people in our society.